December 11, 1944. The air inside the Eagle's Nest bunker was stale and cold, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and old tobacco. Field Marshal von Rundstedt stood facing the wall, his palms flat against it, feeling the grit bite into his skin. Beside him, Walter Model stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tightly it trembled, while Otto von Manschufel fixed his eyes on a dark stain in the concrete as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence itself was an insult. Boots scraped behind them. SS men moved with deliberate slowness, enjoying every second. Sidearms were removed, metal clinking softly as they were taken away, the sound echoing far louder than it should have. Briefcases were ripped open, papers spilled onto the floor, fingers digging through personal notes and maps with careless contempt. These were not enemy soldiers performing a search. This was ritual humiliation. Men who had commanded hundreds of thousands were being handled like suspects, like traitors. Rundstedt felt something deeper than anger. It was the quiet, suffocating rage of a man raised on a code that no longer existed. He had been taught that rank carried dignity, that command demanded respect. Even defeat, in the old Prussian sense, had rules. But there were no rules left now. Only fear, suspicion, and the crude power of ideology. The SS officer behind him cleared his throat loudly, as if reminding them who owned the room, who owned the Reich now. Model's thoughts drifted not to strategy or the front lines, but to memory. Parades, crisp uniforms, the old army where obedience was earned, not enforced with pistols and sneers. Manschufel, younger than the others, felt a different sting. Not nostalgia, but betrayal. They were still fighting, still bleeding, still holding together collapsing fronts by will alone. And yet here they were, treated as liabilities, as men already half condemned. Somewhere deeper in the bunker, a door slammed, voices murmured. Adolf Hitler was waiting. Rundstedt knew what was coming before a word was spoken. Another miracle plan, another promise that ignored reality. Another demand for faith from men who could see the map clearly and knew the war was slipping away. This humiliation was not an accident. It was a warning. Power in Germany had shifted, and it had shifted away from soldiers. As they were finally ordered to lower their hands, Rundstedt straightened his back, not in defiance, but in instinct. If this was the beginning of the end, then it would begin here, against a concrete wall, under the gaze of men who feared the truth more than defeat. Outside, the war thundered on. Inside, something older and more fragile had just been broken, and none of them believed it could ever be repaired. The silence in the bunker was suffocating, heavy with the weight of impending disaster. Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the room, his posture rigid, as though he believed the force of his presence could turn the tides of the war. His eyes gleamed with an unshakable conviction, the same dangerous confidence that had driven him from the streets of Vienna to the heart of Europe. He was, as always, the master of illusion, the man who saw victory where others saw only defeat. "Operation Watch on the Rhine," Hitler proclaimed, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "The Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 soldiers will smash through the Ardennes, and we will reclaim the port of Antwerp. We will show the Americans the might of the German army. They are nothing but cowboys and playboys. They will break at the first shot just as they did at Kasserine Pass. We will have them running before they know what hit them." The generals stood in rigid attention, but inside, a quiet storm brewed. Walter Model's face was a mask of disbelief, but his hands, clenched behind his back, betrayed his uncertainty. Otto von Manschufel exchanged a brief glance with Rundstedt, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. This plan, this so-called masterstroke, was not the answer. Manschufel, who had fought the Americans on the front lines, knew the truth that Hitler refused to see. The Americans were not cowards. They were not fragile playboys who would fold at the first sign of adversity. Manschufel had watched them fight with a resolve that came not from bravado, but from a deep, unshakable belief in their cause. Their soldiers were raw, their tactics unconventional, but they were relentless. And above all, they adapted. The Germans had underestimated them once, and it had cost them dearly. But Hitler would not hear it. His words were a blinding flood of arrogance, sweeping away the caution of those who had seen the truth. "The Americans are afraid of us," he continued, his eyes flicking over the faces of his generals. "They are nothing compared to us. They will break as they always have. We will drive them out of Europe and turn the tide of this war." For a moment, there was only the sound of his voice, rising in fervor as he spoke of victory. He was convinced of his own brilliance, as he always had been. But in that room, the seasoned officers, the men who had faced the Allies in battle, could see what Hitler could not. This was no masterstroke. It was the desperate plan of a man too blinded by his own pride to recognize the grim reality of the war. Field Marshal Rundstedt, standing rigid and silent, knew the futility of this assault. The Allies were not the same as they had been in North Africa or Italy. They were a well-oiled machine, and their resolve, though untested on German soil, was undeniable. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the bitter realization that this battle was not a stroke of genius, but the final gasp of a dying regime. Yet none of them spoke. There was no room for dissent in this room, not even the slightest hint of challenge. Instead, they listened, unwilling to voice their doubts in the face of their Führer's conviction. It was easier to nod, to feign agreement, than to argue with a man who had already made up his mind. And so, as Hitler continued to outline the plan, promising victory and glory, a quiet resistance simmered beneath the surface. Manschufel knew the truth. This was not the victory they had hoped for. The Battle of the Bulge would be their last. It would expose the cracks in their strategy, and the Americans would not break. They would fight back harder than ever. It was only a matter of time before the arrogance of this masterstroke unraveled. In that bunker, Hitler's words fell on ears too deaf to hear the truth. The stage was set for disaster, and the fall of the Reich had already begun. The German generals had a single name on their minds: Patton. Or rather, they didn't. George S. Patton was an enigma to them, a man they hadn't bothered to track, a shadow in the midst of far larger concerns. Their intelligence officers had carefully compiled extensive dossiers on every major Allied commander, yet Patton's name was conspicuously absent. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, each one had a file thick with information, meticulously detailing every movement, every tactical decision, every rumor. But Patton? Nothing. It wasn't as if the Germans didn't know the Americans were coming. They knew the Allies were preparing for D-Day, but the assumption was that it would be Eisenhower and Montgomery leading the charge. They had the profiles to prove it. And so, when the moment came, when the invasion struck at Normandy, it was not Patton who was in their sights. He was simply ignored. They believed, like so many others, that he had been sidelined after the infamous slapping incident, a man too reckless, too prone to error to be a real threat. The lack of intelligence on Patton was not just a minor oversight, it was a glaring mistake. For the Germans, the story was simple. If they feared anyone, it was Montgomery, the cautious British commander with his predictable movements, or perhaps Bradley, whose steady leadership seemed a direct reflection of America's industrial might. But Patton? He was an afterthought, the kind of man who might make a headline but would never make history. At least that was what they thought. And so, the days passed and Patton continued his work behind the scenes, quietly making his mark on the Third Army, preparing for a breakout that would shock the German command. The Germans, meanwhile, went about their business, convinced they had the upper hand. The arrogance was palpable. How could they possibly fear someone they had already dismissed as irrelevant? But then came the shock. Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy like a flood, moving with a speed that defied belief. In just 2 weeks, Patton's men had covered 400 miles. The German generals, who had been watching the wrong men, suddenly found themselves blindsided. They were watching the wrong general. They had thought Patton would be easy to predict, easy to outmaneuver. Instead, they watched in stunned disbelief as the very man they had ignored tore through their defenses faster than they could comprehend. The Germans had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. The myth of Patton, the reckless, undisciplined general, was quickly dispelled. In the chaos of battle, the truth became clear. Patton was not just another officer. He was a force. He was the one man who could turn the tide of war, and the Germans had failed to see it until it was too late. And so the myth grew. The Germans, who had once dismissed him as a sideshow, began to claim that Patton was the one man who had kept them up at night. But the reality was different. They hadn't feared him. They hadn't even been watching him. Now, however, the truth was undeniable. Patton had become the face of American aggression, and the German generals could only watch as he shattered their assumptions and their defenses. The commander they had failed to track would become the one they feared the most. The Germans had their eyes on a handful of American commanders, some because they feared them, others because they knew exactly what to expect. Mark Clark, for example, had earned genuine contempt from the German high command. His obsession with his own image made him predictable, almost laughable. He was tall, photogenic, a man whose vanity seeped into every decision he made. He was more concerned with headlines and public relations than with military strategy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, couldn't hide his disdain when asked about Clark. He was a man of vanity, Kesselring said, always positioning photographers, always seeking glory. It was that very predictability that made Clark a liability. His forces broke out of the Anzio beachhead in May 1944, exposing the retreating German 10th Army. He had a golden opportunity to cut them off and annihilate them. Instead, Clark turned his attention toward Rome. Why? Because he wanted the photographs, the headlines, the glory of liberating the First Axis capital. The result was tragic. The German 10th Army escaped, and the lives of American soldiers were needlessly lost in the northern Italian mud. Clark's vanity had cost them the chance to end the war in Italy earlier. The Germans saw Clark as an asset, but not in the way he thought. His need for glory was so obvious that they knew exactly how he would act. They didn't need to study him. His decisions were self-explanatory. And while Clark was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Allied high command in the eyes of the Germans, there were others they respected. Bernard Montgomery, for instance, was a commander they could predict, though not in the same way as Clark. Montgomery's cautious, methodical approach to warfare made him both predictable and beatable. The Germans knew exactly how he would act. He would never attack until he had overwhelming force, and he would never push forward without first bombarding the enemy for days. His attacks were slow and deliberate. German commanders understood his tactics and used them against him. They knew that Montgomery would never take risks, and that predictability, while reliable, made him vulnerable. It was the very reason why Montgomery was so hard to defeat in battles where he had the advantage, but equally easy to outmaneuver when his plans were thwarted. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as the chief of staff for von Rundstedt, famously demonstrated Montgomery's predictable nature during an interrogation. He mimicked Montgomery's slow, methodical movements, one foot placed carefully before the other, never rushing, never making sudden moves. The Germans could set their watches by Montgomery's actions. He required at least 2:1 superiority in men and 4:1 in tanks. They knew he would bombard for days, then halt at nightfall to consolidate his position instead of pressing forward. While Montgomery's methods worked when he had overwhelming numbers and time, they also made him vulnerable to a faster, more agile opponent. Then there was Omar Bradley, a commander who didn't attract the same kind of attention as Clark or Montgomery but commanded the largest American force in Europe, over 1 million men in the 12th Army Group. The German generals respected Bradley's steady competence, his professionalism, and his methodical approach to warfare. But while they recognized him as a reliable, competent leader, they did not fear him the way they feared Patton. Bradley was not flashy, not eccentric. He did not make bold, decisive moves. Instead, he applied relentless pressure in a steady, methodical way, grinding down the enemy until they had no choice but to break. The Germans respected him, but they did not see him as an existential threat. They knew what he would do. He was too reliable, too professional to be feared. But where the Germans made their mistake was in overlooking the true power behind these commanders, the American machine. The unrelenting, unstoppable force of the Allied war effort was not embodied by any one individual. It was embodied in the vast industrial might that powered the American war machine. When Clark failed to cut off the retreating German army, another division was already waiting to take its place. When Montgomery's cautious strategy stalled, more tanks and artillery were on the way, ready to push forward. When Bradley's slow, steady push ground to a halt, more reinforcements flooded in, and the war effort continued unabated. The Germans, obsessed with individual commanders and their tactics, failed to see the bigger picture. They feared the unpredictability of Patton, the speed of his movements, the lightning-fast maneuvers that left them no time to react. But Patton was not an isolated force. He was a cog in a machine that could move faster than the German army ever could. It was the American industrial system, the endless supply of soldiers, tanks, ammunition, and equipment that ensured the Allies' victory. This was the true power the Germans were up against, and no individual commander, not even Montgomery or Bradley, could match it. In the end, it wasn't the generals who the Germans feared. It was the machine, the relentless, grinding power of the American war effort, with its seemingly endless resources and its ability to adapt and overcome every obstacle. That was what terrified them more than any single commander. That was what made victory inevitable for the Allies. In August 1944, everything changed. The Allies had been pressing forward for weeks, but it was Patton's Third Army that brought an unexpected ferocity to the battlefield. As the breakout from Normandy unfolded, the Germans watched in stunned disbelief as the American forces moved faster than anyone thought possible. 400 miles in just 2 weeks. The map, once their ally, suddenly became their enemy. The lines they had drawn, the positions they had secured, all started to shift and blur as if they had never existed. The math, once so certain, no longer added up. The Germans thought they had time. But then, through the smoke and dust, came the unmistakable sound of Sherman engines. Loud, powerful, relentless. The roar of the tanks was a shock to the system, a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of the war. For months, the Germans had expected the war to play out as it always had, with slow, methodical movements that gave them the time to react, to reorganize, to strike back. But Patton's forces shattered that expectation with every mile they covered, every town they liberated, every move they made. The German high command was not prepared for this. Their intelligence network, which had been so reliable in tracking the movements of other Allied forces, couldn't keep up with Patton. He was moving too fast, too aggressively. His Third Army didn't just push forward. It surged forward with an unstoppable momentum, consuming everything in its path. Where other commanders might have stalled, Patton pressed on, moving so quickly that his divisions were often well ahead of their supply lines, their communications, and even their maps. It was as if Patton had rewritten the rules of war. In the early days of the breakout, the Germans thought it was just a bold offensive, one they could easily counter. But as the days passed and the miles mounted, the realization set in. They were facing something unlike anything they had anticipated. Patton wasn't simply advancing. He was outpacing them. His ability to move so quickly left the German forces scrambling, unable to reposition their defenses fast enough. And as each day passed, their sense of security eroded, replaced by panic and confusion. German commanders on the front lines began reporting that the American forces had moved so fast that their maps were obsolete within hours. Their intelligence was outdated the moment it was gathered. And it wasn't just Patton's speed that shook them. It was the American resolve behind it. The Germans had thought the Americans might break, just as they had at Kasserine Pass, when they had stumbled under pressure. But this was different. Patton's men were driven, unrelenting. Every time the Germans thought they had a chance to regroup, Patton was already on the move, already taking the fight to them again. By the time the Germans realized the full extent of their mistake, it was too late. The American Third Army had already seized the initiative, advancing with a fluidity and efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. The Germans had underestimated not just Patton, but the entire American war machine. They had thought they were fighting men. They didn't realize they were fighting an unstoppable force. In those 2 weeks, Patton's legend was forged. His name, which had once been a curiosity to the Germans, now struck fear into their hearts. The speed of his movements, the ferocity of his attack, and the relentless drive of his men marked a turning point in the war. It wasn't just a breakthrough in territory, it was a breakthrough in perception. The Germans could no longer afford to ignore Patton. They had to face the reality of what the American army was capable of. Patton's Third Army had shown the Germans something they had never faced before. A new kind of warfare, one driven by speed, audacity, and the overwhelming power of American industrial might. The Germans were no longer fighting a battle. They were trying to survive a war of attrition that they could not win. The speed of Patton's Third Army was not just a tactical advantage. It was the death knell for their dreams of victory. And they knew it. It wasn't just Patton. It wasn't just the men leading the charge. It was the American machine, the unstoppable industrial power behind every maneuver. The Germans could destroy commanders, but they could not destroy the relentless tide of resources and manpower. Against this force, individual commanders didn't matter. The machine didn't need brilliance, it needed management, and it would grind down everything in its path. For the German high command, this realization came too late. They had spent years studying their enemies, focusing on individual figures like Patton, Montgomery, and Bradley, analyzing their strategies, their strengths, their weaknesses. But in the end, it wasn't the brilliance of the commanders that defeated them. It was the sheer scale of the American war effort. The American military machine, fueled by the vast industrial power of the United States, kept churning out soldiers, tanks, planes, and ammunition faster than the Germans could destroy them. It was an avalanche of resources, an overwhelming tide that never stopped coming, that never paused to breathe. The Germans, for all their military precision, could not match this. They couldn't outlast it. As the war dragged on, they found themselves in a battle not against men, but against a system, an engine of war that ran on endless supplies, manufactured and delivered with an efficiency the Germans could not fathom. For every tank that was destroyed, 5 more would roll out of American factories. For every division that fell, another one would take its place, ready to fight. The psychological toll on the German generals was immense. They could not outrun it. They could not outthink it. The very fact that the Americans could replace their losses so quickly shattered the German command's ability to respond. Patton's speed and Truscott's brilliance were impressive, but it was the knowledge that they were only part of a much greater machine that truly paralyzed the German will to fight. This wasn't a war of men. It was a war of systems, and the Americans had perfected their system. The Germans didn't fear Patton's tanks or Montgomery's careful calculations. They feared the unyielding march of American production, the cold, relentless machinery that powered the Allies' every move. It was a force they could not fight, a force they could not control. They couldn't name it. They didn't understand it. They simply knew that they couldn't stop it. And so, as the final push came, as the American forces advanced into Germany and the skies were filled with the roar of bombers and tanks, the Germans were left with the horrifying truth. They had been defeated not by any single man, but by the future of warfare itself. A future where the fight was not decided by the genius of individual commanders, but by an unrelenting machine that could not be beaten. The war ended, but the truth remained. It wasn't the men who had won. It was the machine. The future of war was not in the hands of generals, but in the hands of systems that could outlast, outfight, and outproduce any enemy that dared stand in its way. And as the dust settled, the world knew one thing for certain. The American machine had forged a new era of warfare, and the Germans had realized too late that they could not fight what they couldn't name.